10 days have passed since my return. We celebrated my arrival with a feast. We had a feast in the windowless hut where we were resting. True, there was no vodka or biscuits. But war is war. The surplus food found in the hut was left only for me and my friends. Let the other soldiers starve to death. We warmed our feet in large basins of warm water, or looked for lice, or organised lice runs. But the empty pastime soon became tiresome. We were tired of hearing the same stories 1,000 times. Soon we were seized by indifference, which is so characteristic of soldiers at the front. Nothing surprised us. We had already seen everything. For 10 days we hung around between the trench and the hut where we rested. Every 12 hours we walked 20 kilometres, separating the outpost from the ruins of the village. During the day, we looked over the empty space that stretched in front of the trench. At night, we could see nothing at a distance of 3 or 4 metres because of the fog. We had not yet really encountered the Russians. Their offensive had not yet gained full strength. Occasionally, Soviet tanks appeared. We opened fire. Once they shelled our frozen batteries. When it was quiet, we killed time by looking at the snow stuck to our boots, which became hard as stone during 12 hours of guard duty. And then, when we returned to the hut, softened again. It was strictly forbidden to make fire. The smoke could give away the location of our position. Often Vesredo visited us. I think that he had a special warmth for our detachment. With the veteran, he spoke on equal terms, as a man to a man. And we, the youth, listened to their conversations like boys to adults, but we never learned anything positive. Our exhausted troops left Kiev, which remained the centre of the battle. We tried to hold the Dnieper, but it was of little use. Both its banks were now in the hands of the Russians. In Nedragilov, victory was also impossible. Our soldiers faced a choice, either captivity or death. Fortunately, we had to cover only the southern wing of the front. We were in a section where there were no more mountains than on a billiard table. It was difficult to create a strong defence here. On the 12th day after my return, we were attacked by Russian planes. Many soldiers were killed, and in the evening of the same day, German units, expelled from Cherkasy, appeared on the horizon. 7 or 8 regiments in rags, hungry, burdened with wounded, descended on us like locusts and began to destroy our supplies. You could easily read in their faces what kind of fighting they had to endure. The soldiers had time to retreat from Kherson and the western bank of the Dnieper. Just then, as if on purpose, winter began to show what it can do. The thermometer fell to -20. On one of the frosty evenings, the enemy reached our positions. We heard the noise of tanks well in advance. Like a hunted herd, the soldiers sitting in the trenches, wrapped in blankets and rags, listened to the alarming sounds and stared into the void with frozen eyes, which were tearful from the frost. Though no one saw anything, one and another spoke. "Here they are!" 1,000 thoughts, 1,000 memories flashed through our minds. A distant homeland, family, friends, desperate love. We went over the options for the outcome of the battle. Surrender, capture, escape. Escape. Wouldn't it be better to die and end it all once and for all? But someone had already grabbed a weapon and imagined how heroically he would defend the position, would repel the Russians and would stand to the death. But the majority resigned themselves to death. It was this resignation, however, that led to heroic deeds. Cowards or pacifists who opposed Hitler from the beginning often saved both their own lives and the lives of others, despite desperate fear, justified by the dire situation. In the face of the Russian hurricane, we fled. But we had no choice. We became heroes without glory. With difficulty, we overcame the superior might of the enemy. We stopped fighting for Hitler, for National Socialism, for the Third Reich, and even for our sweethearts, mothers, families under bombardment. We fought out of fear. It gave us strength. The thought of death made us impotent rage. Maybe it's a shame to fight for that. But such motives are far more powerful than any ideology. Yes, we fought for ourselves, not to die in trenches full of mud and snow. We, like rats, were ready to cling to the enemy, even if he was 1,000 times superior to us. Fear turned our positions into a desperately fought fortress, and it was difficult for the Russians to break through. We lay in the frozen ground and listened to the noise behind our trenches. A sack of potatoes, gals, stirred and came closer to me. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. "They've got tanks. Apart from the noise of the tanks, I heard nothing at first. Then songs were heard. They had been drawn out by the Russians. Now they were enthusiastic, like all the soldiers of the advancing army. "A year and a half ago we marched on Moscow. I was singing songs then too," the veteran said. The sounds that reached us grew louder and quieter, but they did not stop. The soldiers who had been resting in the hut returned to their forward positions. Everyone was now on the battle line. Even the auxiliary soldiers were forced to defend the village. The front line was shallow, but greatly stretched. Our division held 100 kilometres. Regiments stood close together. We were many, but they were 30 times as many. Icicles were forming on nostrils, lips, collars from breathing. The hands and feet of most of the soldiers were frostbitten. Usually in the evenings we walked from corner to corner around the trench to keep warm, but today it was just dangerous. Everyone froze in place. The ground and we ourselves were covered with crusts of ice. From time to time we had to warm our weapons. When we touched the icy metal, it was like an electric shock. The Russian troops to the east were silent. We could only hear the engines murmuring. From time to time we heard the death rattle of a horse. We were desperate for sleep. For 5-10 minutes we fell into slumber without closing our eyes. Then we came back to reality. We waited for dawn. At this time, people and animals often die of frost. The Russians were in no hurry. A whole day had passed since we heard the first sounds, but nothing had happened. Their counterattack would most likely have resulted in victory. We were ordered not to retreat. Each man was to have 4 hours duty in the front line and 4 hours rest. This kept the minimum number of soldiers in position. Many fell asleep at the guns, but suddenly woke up, pushed by their comrades. We were losing the sick and wounded. They went to the hospital on foot or on horseback, and no reinforcements were coming. "Like a trap," the veteran said. At dusk we found Lindbergh. He was standing there without pants. He'd gone to a latrine nearby and was so cold he couldn't walk. When we saw him, he was crying like a baby. He wouldn't have lasted much longer. By the next morning, the Russians still hadn't moved to attack. We were getting more and more nervous. An airplane flew by and dropped 4 sacks of mail. I got 4 letters, 2 from my parents and 2 from Paula. They were all way late. The letters from France were a month late at all. I eagerly read the lines of Paula's letter. She had nothing good to report. She had been sent to a factory 60 kilometres from Berlin. It had become impossible to live in the capital. The parents' letter caused only irritation. My father, as always, limited himself to 2 lines, and my mother's pitiful tone made me furious. I told Wiener about it, to which he replied, "That's all the French are capable of complaining." I realized from my mother's letter that she had no idea what was happening to me. Poor thing asked me to take care of myself, not to get into trouble, to follow all orders and not to take senseless risks. I didn't even know what to think after reading such advice. I took my eyes off the letter and turned them to the white snowdrifts, from which the danger was coming. The letters I read did not inspire the soldiers. One or the other learned of the death of a close relative or friend in a bombing raid. "This mail is a nuisance," said a lanky fellow. He looked at his friend, who was sobbing like a child. In the afternoon, a blizzard began. We sent several squads to scout. The commanders got tired of waiting. They decided to provoke the enemy. We heard some shots, then the scouts returned. They reported that they saw the Russians have a lot of different equipment. Before nightfall, my comrades and I were awakened. With beating hearts, we took up forward positions. Apparently, through the snowstorm, tanks were preparing to march on us. The frozen ground shook underfoot from the tracks. The soldiers standing at the anti-tank guns did not take their eyes off the telescopic sights, which had to be constantly wiped. Several anti-tank trenches were dug, but they were too few. We knew, if the tanks came through, we were finished. Everyone prepared anti-tank grenades. Olensheim, Ballers, Freiwitz and others were preparing to fire a large-caliber machine gun. Snowfall blinded the eyes. To the north opened fire self-propelled machine gun. The rumble of the tanks was unusually loud, but they themselves were still not visible. To the north the battle had already begun. Despite the fact that a snowstorm had begun and it was getting dark, flashes constantly lit up the sky. From the short bursts of anti-tank guns there was an unusual muffled echo. Now the tanks appeared. They were coming at full speed. We counted 5 vehicles. They were running parallel to our line of defence. The anti-tank brigade was already firing. Wiener calmly put the muzzle of the machine gun in his shoulder. The muzzles of the tank's guns were pointed at us. 5 shells left traces on the T-34, but the tank was not seriously damaged and was coming straight at us. It had already come to a distance of 10 metres when an anti-tank shell hit the turret. Thick black smoke fell and began to drift on the ground. The hatches opened. We heard screams and groans. Soon they were drowned out by a powerful explosion. The tank was blown to pieces. The remains of human bodies scattered in all directions. But we didn't shout, "Hurrah!" From our position came only the barking of machine guns. A shell hit the second tank, and smoke billowed from it too. The tape ran through my fingers. We shot the crew of the stopped tank without pity. Now we could breathe easy. All around us, fires were blazing. Russian tanks continued to advance. One of them approached our positions and almost reached us. Our hair stood on end. The anti-tank gun was working at maximum speed. In 3 seconds, the soldiers turned the gun, and immediately a shot rang out. The engine of the tank stalled, 2 bright flashes appeared on the right, and there was a huge explosion. Another tank opened fire on our ranks. Lumps of frozen earth flew into the air. I almost did not realize what was happening. Another tank on our right caught fire. "Faust Patron, glory!" shouted someone. Our guns were firing at the tank that had penetrated our rear. Its engine stopped. Then there was an explosion and its left side collapsed. But our gaze was fixed on the T-34, whose tracks crushed everyone who fell under them. One of our armoured personnel carriers, armed with an anti-tank machine gun, opened fire. And the anti-tank gun crew had a problem. Freiwitz was wounded, possibly mortally. We opened fire with machine guns on the tank, which, without slowing down, was tearing toward our positions. 2 shells exploded near the armoured personnel carrier. The third exploded right in front of us. The enemy tank, which released them, fleeing from pursuit, disappeared in a storm of snow. The Russian offensive, undertaken by the armoured forces, smothered. The battle lasted no more than half an hour. The Russians were clearly anxious to test us. Part of the tanks were destroyed or hit. The Russians were defeated, but for their huge armada it meant nothing. For us, despite the lesser damage suffered, the loss of 4 anti-tank guns was a serious problem. For a moment, the tension eased. In the trenches, the telephones rang. Their superiors demanded a report. The veteran leaned against the wall of the trench and lit a cigarette, even though it was forbidden. To us in the trench came down gals. "They say that Wessradau's Dugout was crushed by a T-34, he said, taking a breath. We stared at him, waiting for further news. "Stay here," finally said the veteran. "I'm going to see what's going on there." "Watch out, don't smoke," warned gals. "Thank you." The veteran put out the cigarette butt and stuffed it into the cuff of his sleeve. Half an hour later he came back. We had to dig for 10 minutes while Wessradau was extracted, but he and 2 other officers are all right. They only got a few scratches. A liaison soldier died. He must have panicked and tried to go inside. We found his body in the ruins. We were glad our commander was safe. After all, our survival depended on him being alive. We felt a great affection for him. By the next morning the snowfall had stopped. On the plain we could see the skeletons of tanks not completely covered with snow. In the immediate vicinity of our position there were at least 20 of them. From the fire some of the machines had acquired a reddish tint. Apparently the Russians made an attack on our positions in 4 places, along a front of 25 kilometres. One of the attacks came on our position, which was held by 6 companies. The rest of the fighting took place to the north. At 8 o'clock we returned to the front line. Under the pale, heavy sky, everything stood still. Not a sound was heard. I had never seen such a sky anywhere as I had seen in Russia in winter. The diffused light streaming from above gave an unreal glow to the surroundings. Our overcoats stood out against the white snow. Many had put on all their winter clothes, overcoat, vest, coat. They moved slowly and clumsily. The winter clothes were not designed for us and were often torn. From the outside we could be mistaken for a set of dirty pillows. We felt much less stressed. The remains of Russian tanks gave us a sense of superiority, even though we knew that the enemy had not launched a serious attack. Still, we managed to stand our ground against the enemy's dangerous fighting machines. The fact that the tankers were ordered not to go far came only to the minds of veterans. The youth wanted to believe that it was us who stopped them. The captain personally uncorked several bottles of wine intended for the wounded. In the evening we had a drinking party in the huts. In our hut we glorified the anti-tank unit. By the uneven light of 7 or 8 candles, we drank to the health of Ober-Efreianz, Lenzen, Kellermann and Dundee. Grenadier Smellens and Prince took a glass to Captain Vesredau himself, whose left arm was bandaged and whose face was still oozing blood. On the stretcher lay 2 wounded men. We supplied them with tobacco. Gals was enthusiastically recounting the progress of the battle. With his left hand, in which was clenched a glass, he gesticulated, and the right hand scratched under his arms. Lindbergh, as always, when we were lucky, was in high spirits. He was more afraid than the others, and it was already showing on his wrinkled face. Some were already asleep, oblivious to the noise. Those who did not want to sleep were soon drunk. As usual, there were marching songs. We didn't know any others. In the semi-darkness of the hut, the whole scene seemed unreal. The veteran sang a Russian song. We didn't understand him. We did not know whether it was a revolutionary or Ukrainian song. Ukraine was friendly to us. However, it didn't matter now. Ukraine's days were numbered. Everyone sang what they wanted. There was a terrible noise. Gals clung to me, demanding that I sing something in French. Even though I was nauseous, I obeyed. I sang Sambre et Mars and a few other verses. A drunken Gals laughed and shouted, "Hooray! Victory!" After this, a disgusting scene took place. Lenzen lifted himself up, trying to keep his balance. "Who's talking about the French here? What can one expect from these Broads?" He turned to Gals. He had started to dance and now grabbed Lenzen's arm, trying to drag him along with him. "You'd better shut up, you idiot," Lenzen shouted. "Go stick your head in the snow instead of yelling." Gals, who was a head taller than Lenzen, kept dancing. Then Lenzen punched Gals and bellowed at him, taking advantage of his tiny rank advantage. "Lieutenant, at attention! What do you think you are? And you're the one who's shutting me up?" Gals stopped dancing and looked angrily at Lenzen. "Stand still," he shouted, "or you'll be sorry." "You forgot about Sayer." Gals pointed at me. "He's half French. He's lived in France all his life. In fact, the French are on our side. Gals obviously read the same reports I did." "You're a fool. What makes you think that?" "But it's true." Someone else intervened. "I read it myself in the Ostfront. I didn't know who to look at." "Come to your senses, you idiot. So what if those suckers come to our aid? What good are they? Anyone who thinks otherwise is no better, and our dark-haired Southerners are only capable of singing their love songs to the guitar." Lenzen was referring to the eternal feud between South Germany and Prussia. "Lenzen," I said, "you forget, my mother grew up on the outskirts of Berlin." So you have to make a choice. Either you're German, like the rest of us, or you're a frogman. I was about to say that I didn't have much to choose from, but Lenzen didn't let me continue. In Poland, even in Chemnitz, they asked you to make a choice, I remember. But he had already made a choice, roared Gals. He's in the same boat as you, me and all of us. Well then, there's nothing to say he's French. Lenzen's bravery was not to be doubted. He was awarded the Iron Cross for destroying the 7th tank. I was suddenly overcome with a feeling of powerlessness. It seemed to me that I would never achieve what Lenzen had accomplished. The war, as usual, paralysed me. Maybe the soft French blood that runs in my veins and that Lenzen dislikes so much is to blame. How am I better than Lindbergh? He's not a real German either. He was born somewhere in the south near Lake Constance. He is a typical representative of the dark-haired people for whom Lenzen had just resented. Drunken merriment came over everyone again. But I stood aside and began to think. How proud I was of my service. How glad I was that I was no worse than the comrades I loved so much. How desperately I fought against all adversity. Lenzen's unexpected revelations called everything into question. I always thought he didn't like me, but in Poland he saved me, and I thought that my origins were not important to him. Now I know the truth. No matter how hard I try, my comrades, with whom I have suffered so much together, reject me. Do they consider me unworthy to bear German arms? I cursed my parents who had produced me half German and half French. Anger, sadness, a sense of loneliness overwhelmed me. I knew I could count on Gals, Wiener, maybe someone else. But even they were far from me, were near their blood brothers. And I won't be able to sing the German songs I like so much with peace of mind. And one day I will die, and my death will be no better than the death of a black slave beside his master. These thoughts were intolerable. The alcohol-induced longing was even more intense. I went outside for a breath of fresh air. I threw up. The hangover prevented me from thinking, and, back in the hut, I stretched out on the sacks, scratching myself with lice. The next morning the Russian front stirred again. At first we were shelled several times with guns. For several days now the Russians had kept us in a tense state. There was no doubt that they were preparing a powerful offensive, as always taking their time. During the day we received reinforcements, an artillery platoon. We had to dig new trenches, which made the pain in our arms unbearable. In the afternoon we shelled the enemy from large-caliber guns. However, the enemy remained suspiciously calm. As soon as it got dark, ammunition-laden platoons left the trenches and began to advance on the snow-covered ground. We made a sortie. In the night there was the boom of machine guns, grenade explosions, the shouts of the Russians, who did not expect a sudden attack, and the murmur of shells. Without giving the Russians a chance to recollect, we, proud of ourselves, went back to our trenches. As a result, we succeeded in provoking the Russians. With dawn they went on the offensive. As at Belgorod, flames shone across the horizon. We rushed into the trenches, but many fell under fire, having never made it to cover. Once again we plunged into all the horrors of war. It is impossible to get used to the way your comrades moan in the throes of death, no matter how many times you see it. And although I thought I could die a death worthy of a Wehrmacht soldier, I turned into a hunted animal, mad with fear. We no longer counted on the Luftwaffe. However, unexpectedly for us in the sky appeared in the airplanes that delayed the Russian offensive. The next day the enemy responded in the same way. The Russians tried to destroy our artillery by all means. As a result, at night the artillery was withdrawn from its positions, and we were left alone with the enemy to perform feats. For 4 more terrible days we held our trenches, despite the fact that the Russians repeatedly made infantry attacks supported by armoured troops. Whenever possible, we buried the dead where they fell. 83 names were crossed off the company list. Ohlensheim, who had recovered from a severe wound near Belgorod, was shot here on the west bank of the Dnieper. The Russians regrouped and launched a powerful new offensive. It turns out that they delayed it because they were finalizing the last preparations. The enemy artillery, which was becoming more active by the hour, pourrait deadly fire on us. The veteran was wounded and was waiting with the other wounded, of whom there were at least 100, to be evacuated to the hospital. Weiner's place was taken by a paramedic. I continued to feed ammunition for the machine gun, but fired from it clearly, not a skillful soldier as Weiner. The following night was simply terrible. In my memory, only fragments of what happened. Night fell at 5 o'clock. It is only like that in Russia. In summer there is almost no night, and in winter there is no day. We had just withstood 2 or 3 major attacks. Desperate cries on the left told us that many soldiers were dying there. Having emptied 5 magazines, I tried to keep warm by gripping the warm muzzle of the machine gun with my hand. The 6th magazine was the last. Now we had to wait for a supply of new ammunition. The darkness was cut through relentlessly by the flashes of thousands of Russian shells. The trenches were not too deep, and some positions did not reach at all. We had to crawl several hundred meters through the snow mixed with clods of frozen earth. From time to time, soldiers came to us, jumping from one crater to another. They were bringing shells for a 50mm anti-aircraft gun, but one day they were all hit by a shell. We never heard the screams. A few minutes later, the field officer sent me to the site of the explosion to bring at least a couple of machine gun tapes. No sooner had I reached the spot than there were shouts of "Hurrah!" from the Russians, and then grenades and anti-aircraft shells rained down on us. I threw myself down on the ground. Beside me lay the bodies of comrades killed a few minutes ago, and the ammunition I had been sent for was nowhere to be seen. There was the rumble of a tank. Around me the darkness was cut through by bright flashes and pink and yellow explosions. I opened my mouth wide, as the instructions said, so that I wouldn't catch my breath or burst my eardrums. The ground shook so much that I could no longer tell where was the top and where was the bottom. It seemed to me that in the midst of the general noise, I heard the rumble of the machine gun from which we were firing with Weiner. It occurred to me that I was going crazy. There was no way out. The only thing left to do was to crouch on the ground with my head down and wait for death to approach. On the left lay an overturned anti-aircraft gun, but without ammunition and without a crew. Once again, the intimidating rumble of a tank was heard. The darkness was cut through by the light of a searchlight. The tank had broken through our line of defence and was passing 20 metres from where I was lying. Suddenly it caught fire. I almost baked in the hot air. In my semi-conscious state, I heard stomping feet and cursing that sounded distinctly neither German nor French. 3 or 4 pairs of boots were treading behind me. Everything happened so quickly that I did not even realize whether I had seen it or whether I had imagined it. The machine gun kept going, and then there were shouts. Shells burst in the tank, scattering steel shards all around me. Then there was a lull that lasted about 45 minutes. Barely able to stay on my feet, I got up and took a few steps toward the position from which I had left 20 minutes before. But there was nothing left of it, only smoke and motionless bodies. I turned and walked to the rear. I tripped over a dead body, realized that I had lost my rifle, grabbed the other one from a dead soldier, and ran. I heard a few shots and quickly climbed into the trench, where 3 soldiers in about the same condition as me were already sitting. They were staring into the darkness with frozen eyes. I huddled at the bottom of the trench and tried to organize my thoughts. There were still thousands of arrow-sharp flashes in front of my eyes. I did not know what to do next, and only listened to the cries of the soldiers in the trench. To the south, the ground was burning and the sky was split by the rumbling. The Russians had broken through the front on the Dnieper. Several thousand German and Romanian soldiers awaited a terrible death. About 20 regiments could not withdraw in time and laid down their arms. Their only reward awaited them, captivity. But for the rest, the war continued. I decided to get out of the trench I had climbed into. Bending down, I ran with all my legs to other positions where soldiers were bandaging their comrade. Someone greeted me. "Sayer, where did you come from?" There was a rumbling sound in my head. "I don't know. I don't know anything," I mumbled. "Everyone died there. I ran away." Behind us came the sound of an engine, a tractor pulling a heavy anti-tank gun into position. Fatigue acted on us like a drug. We stared stupidly as the enemy ring tightened around us. Then, with desperate cries, praying to God to work a miracle, we threw ourselves at the bottom of the trench and pressed ourselves into the ground. The explosions, which sounded closer and closer each time, reached an extraordinary force. Snow and frozen earth fell on us. Finally, it exploded in our foxhole. We didn't even realize what had happened. We were thrown against the opposite wall. The earth sprinkled. At that moment, feeling the approach of death, I experienced a wild horror and realized that I was going crazy. I was crushed by the earth. I still can't remember what happened without shivering. It is difficult to describe in normal language the feelings that arise when you are buried alive. The dirt covered my face, went down my throat. I felt like I was being doused with something. The more I resisted, the tighter they held me back. Something was pressing on my shoulder. I jerked my head free of the dirt and my helmet, the strap of which was caught in my throat. Desperate thoughts flashed through my mind. In no horrible dream could such a thing be imagined. It was at that moment that I fully realized the meaning of the shouts that I had heard so many times on the battlefield. I understood the meaning of the marching songs that glorified the soldier who dies the death of a hero. Suddenly, dark thoughts come over him. We marched side by side, like brothers, and now he's lying in the mud. My heart is torn with grief. My heart is torn with grief. I realize again how hard it is to see a comrade die, almost as hard as dying myself. During the night, the Russians made 9 unsuccessful attempts to break through our lines. Try 1 or 2 more times, and their advance would have succeeded. For 20 minutes, I, with difficulty getting out of the rubbly, watched as the barrage of fire destroyed our rear, the remains of the village, and 700 men in our regiment alone, whose strength at the beginning of the battle was 2,800 men. Nearby in a pool of blood lay 2 soldiers. The dying man was buried under a whole metre of earth. He could only hope for a miracle. Another wounded soldier groaned in pain. He was covered with earth almost as much as I was. I freed him as quickly as I could and helped him to the rear. On the way, I spotted a rifle and picked it up again. The rest of the night involved a lot of problem-solving. All the odds were against us, and the stakes were one: life. At dawn, in the first rays of the winter day, the front quieted down. The remnants of our regiment gathered. Above the snow-covered plain, dotted with shell craters and corpses, a steely smoke was curling. Those of the wounded, who had not yet frozen to death, were moaning. Their groans resembled the howling of the wind on the roof of a hut in a lost village in the middle of the steppe. Squads were organized to help the orderlies. As usual, the Russians gave us the opportunity to engage in rescuing the wounded. The enemy soldiers were for the most part left on the spot. In connection with the retreat in our army reigned disorder. There was almost no opportunity to take care of thousands of wounded, the number of which was constantly increasing. And the Russians had no hope for us. While the medics were tending to the wounded, a dozen soldiers gathered in the dugout behind the ruined huts where we had slept before. Captain Vesredow, who had just arrived, was among them. Despite the foreboding of disaster, we greeted our friends with joy. Gals, Lenzen, Lindbergh all survived. I was helping a corporal bandage a badly burned hand when Vesredow announced the retreat. He sent us to help the officers count the company and regroup. At dawn, we were to march out. I went with Lenzen to find the remnants of his platoon. The Russians had suffered too, and were now licking their wounds, preparing for a new offensive to crush the remnants of our front. But so far, there was no sign of danger on this cloudy December day. Lenzen couldn't understand what had happened to me. He was amazed that I had survived at all. I explained to him that I didn't understand anything, but he wasn't interested in my opinion. He came up with his own version of what had happened. The warm winter clothes were gone. All that was left was my overcoat. While running away, I picked up a rifle. It turned out to be Russian. Everything made sense to Lenzen. The Russians had attacked the position where I was, but they just didn't see me or thought I was dead. Ameli Ensued. I managed to snatch the Russian's rifle and, shooting back, made my way to my men. "You just can't come to your senses," Lenzen insisted. "It's all right. You'll remember later. I don't see any other explanation." Lenzen's version, of course, suited me just fine. I myself remember only the flashes and rumbling, which completely deafened and blinded me. I could no longer distinguish between west and east, between up and down. Perhaps Lenzen was trying to make amends for the night before. At dusk, which came shortly after noon, the German army left the second front on the Dnieper. The main forces of the Russian army was on the offensive against the German and Romanian troops concentrated to the south. Our units were given the opportunity to withdraw from the occupied positions. Everything that could not be taken away with them had to be abandoned. Regiments of the Greater Germany, half of which were on foot, went on the road. We prayed for one thing, that the heavens would at least briefly hold back the deadly rain that the enemy would surely begin to pour on us. The experience of the previous day prevented us from reacting adequately to what was happening. We looked at everything with frozen eyes, as if we had been drugged. An officer was speaking in front of us, either with a speech or a report, but we heard nothing. We looked up at the sky to avoid thinking about the earth that sustained human life. Either an explosion or a field officer's whistle could have brought us out of lethargy. But at least a semblance of order was maintained in this sector. We, too, tried to regain at least a little of our former strength and morale. The Russians were advancing southward with such fierceness that Romanian territory was enemy territory as well. Soon we would be fighting in Hungary and reach Budapest. The officer continued to razzle-dazzle. He talked about a counter-offensive, the need to seize the initiative, to regroup. He even mentioned the word victory, although it had long since lost all meaning for us. We had not accepted the inevitability of defeat, but we had already realized that it was impossible to win. We knew that we would be required to make every effort to defend ourselves, but we also understood that we would not be able to stop the enemy at the German border. Despite this, we were not going to surrender. Those who survived did not want to accept the facts. Then, although we were very determined, we were in no condition to fight. We needed some rest. "General Friesener has re-established the southern front," the officer rumbled. "Our regiments will be reformed and reinforced with significant reserves. The enemy must not go any further, and you will stop him. We were divided into platoons, companies, and regiments and loaded into cars. Gasoline was still available. The Great Germany units were sent to the north, which we were surprised at, because the main parts of the division were fighting with Army Group Centre. Some companies had already fought with Army Group North. We reached the train, standing on a single track. It was covered by a pine forest. There was no station. We rode in a variety of cars. The platoon I was in was loaded on an open platform, exactly as I had already arrived from Poland to Russia. Today, Russia was no longer to be feared. The Germans had long ago been driven out of it. We were heading north. We moved cautiously, fearing mined roads and bombing. We reached Lodz by train. We stayed there for 30 hours. The front line was close by. As in all border towns, Lodz was full of troops and was also regrouping. From the regimental list, a quarter, then a third, and even half of the names were crossed off. All of them were killed or missing. In Lodz there was a Greater Germany assembly point set up in a candy store. All the counters and goods were pulled out of there. On the door of the gatekeeper's room hung a sign with the image of a white helmet on a black background, the emblem of the regiment. Sentries stood on either side of the door. "Here we are," said Lenzen. "Welcome back to the Great Germany." For an hour and a half we wandered around the city, from which all the civilians had left, to find this house. Lieutenant Vollers handed the officer a list of the soldiers with him. The list listed companies, regiments, and platoons. There were 200 of us. "This is the list of those who came with me, Mr. Captain. "Did you bring a horde of Russians, Lieutenant?" asked the captain, looking us over from head to toe. Many were dressed in Russian coats. "My fault, Mr. Captain. We don't have enough uniforms." "Yes," sighed the officer. "Let's hurry to the warehouse." He nodded toward the squat building. "Maybe you'll find something. Only one foot here, the other there." There were enough uniforms in the warehouse. A lot of people had gotten almost everything they needed. While waiting, we looked at the newly mobilized. It was the Volkssturm, a battalion of new recruits. Yes, things went very badly if they take such people to fight. Some of the recruits were at least 65. But it was even stranger to see young men. To us, who had been through so much at the age of 18, 19, 20, the young reinforcements seemed to be young men, but not teenagers. Here, on the other hand, we were faced with real children. The oldest was 16 years old, but there were some who were clearly no more than 13. They were dressed in worn-out uniforms meant for men, and on their shoulders they carried rifles hardly larger than themselves. The scene was both comic and tragic. They had an anxious expression in their eyes, but they did not yet know where they had been thrown. Some were laughing, oblivious to the rigours of the discipline they had been taught for 3 weeks now. Some had satchels. Instead of textbooks, they contained food and clothes carefully stocked by their mothers. Some were selling candied sweets, the kind of candy that was on cards for those under 13. The old men walking beside them looked at them with uncomprehending eyes. What would become of them? Where would they be sent? The questions remained unanswered. Did the command expect to stop the Red Army with their help? Would total war swallow them up? Are the Germans heroes, or have they gone completely insane? Who will appreciate such self-sacrifice? We stood in silence and watched the recruits' childhood end, and we were powerless to help them. A few hours later, we were brought to the assembly point in Medau. Here was a large part of our division, which had separated from us in the south. Even our regiment was there. We saw the familiar faces of the officers and were surprised to see how powerful Great Germany was. Our mood improved because no one wanted to accept the inevitability of collapse. We had to look for the lesser evil, either bloody battles or captivity, or simply the end. The gaps left in the division were now filled by young recruits. Among the old acquaintances, we were surprised to see Weiner, a veteran. He was no less surprised than we were to learn that we were still alive. "We can't part," he exclaimed. "When I left you at the second front on the Dnieper, the future seemed so bleak. I never thought I would see any of you again." "Many died," said Vollers. "It can't be helped. War." We informed Weiner of the death of Vesredau and Frösch, and he gave us the names of others who were no longer with us. We asked Weiner if he knew anything about Germany, how the civilians lived there. We all had someone to worry about. We listened to him with bated breath. "I was in the hospital in Kenzie, in Poland," he said. "I lost so much blood that for 2 days they couldn't do anything about me. I never thought I had so much life in me. It's so easy to take your last breath and fall down the hole." But it wasn't. For 10 days I moaned. The first 2 days were particularly bad. I got some kind of disease, and then they had a lot of trouble with me. But I'm here now, and I'm looking forward to another goddamn fight. Now I'm sick from the damp. It turns out I've got rheumatism, and that's incurable, you old joker. "But you should have been given a vacation." "Yes, gals, I was in Germany. I've been to Frankfurt, not the one on the Main, but on the Oder. I could have gone deeper, but why? They put us in a girls' school, only there were no girls there. They wouldn't let us eat. Well, at least they left us alone. By the way, have you noticed I'm missing an ear?" He had a sardonic grin on his face. When we looked, we saw that he had indeed lost his right ear. There was a pink scar that looked like it was about to burst. But many were missing some body part. We didn't pay attention to such details anymore. "Yes," said the prince. "You look like a dead man from this side." The veteran smirked. "You're so used to talking to dead people that now you see them everywhere." Enough talk, Solma intervened. Better tell me, how is it in Germany? Well, how to say? There was silence. It lasted for ages. How is life in Frankfurt? Feldfebel Sperlowski pushed us out of the way and squeezed in closer. Frankfurt was his hometown. His family was probably stationed there. The veteran lowered his head. He was immersed in memories. The school was on the east bank of the Oder, on a hill. From there you could see half the city. Everything was grey, the colour of dead trees. Here and there, walls blackened by the fire. People lived like infantrymen in a trench. Sperlowski's face twitched. His voice trembled. And our fighters, artillery, isn't the air defence active? Yes, of course. But what's the use? Don't worry, Sperlowski, said Wollers. Your family was evacuated long ago. No, shouted Sperlowski. His wife wrote that she was taken for defence work, so she stayed in the city. She has no right to leave. Wiener understood how his words affected us. We were expecting good news, but he didn't care. There is a war of all against all, he repeated like a robot. No one and nothing will be spared. German soldiers must be ready for anything. Shocked Sperlowski stepped back. He staggered as if drunk. German soldiers must be prepared for everything in this world. After all, we created it ourselves. We are only suited for this world. There's no place for us in any other world. Lenzen stood frozen and listened with a stony expression. Is it like that in all cities? He asked. He must have been thinking of his own town. I wouldn't know. The veteran dismissed him. In the war, you can't get away with anything. You know how to lighten the mood. Gals did not hide his annoyance. You wanted to hear the truth, not fairy tales. I felt like I was wading through fog and ruins. I knew I wouldn't survive another disappointment. Of course, my first thought was of Paula. But it had been so long since I had heard from her that I didn't know if I would be able to read her letter if the mail came. So much bad news was reaching me that I had lost the ability to feel it, just like a barrel filled to the brim with rainwater. Bring all the rivers in the world to it. It can't hold more water than it has. Here we are in the third winter of war, and the older ones, the fifth or even the sixth, and back on the road again. At night we drove without light, fearing Russian airplanes which occupied bases in Poland. They were especially active during the day. We passed through Prussia, Lithuania, Courland, where the remnants of several German divisions continued to fight. In the darkness and fog, we could see streams of people making their way on foot. At first, we took them for infantrymen, but soon realized that we were facing civilians. We could easily imagine their condition. We crossed the Prussian border. We reached the homeland of Lenzen and Smellens. Lenzen stood up and peered over the railroad car fence. The others were not too interested in the landscape. It wasn't much different from the Polish landscape. Only there were more ponds, but everywhere else was just forest. I wish you were here at Christmas, Lenzen sighed and smiled. Now it is impossible to appreciate the beauty of this place. But the beauty didn't interest us too much. Lenzen spoke again. Wake up! You're in Germany, he exclaimed. Think how long you have waited for this moment. In East Germany, Wiener remarked. Almost at the front. I don't know if you realise where we're going. I have a compass. We're heading northeast, and that's not good enough. Lenzen even blushed with rage. You suckers! That's the kind of defeatists we suffer from. Underneath it all, you've already lost the war. You're just forced to fight, so you fight. Shut up. There were 5 or 6 voices. If they want us to win the war, they can treat us like normal soldiers. All you guys can do is cry. I don't see anything else. From Voronezh on, the war was already lost for you. Why isn't it? Gals asked. You still have to fight, I tell you that. You have no choice. There is no way out. The veteran stood up. Yes, Lenzen. We will go into battle. We, like you, cannot bear defeat. We really have no choice. I certainly don't. I've become part of this machine, and I can't do otherwise. I've been fighting for too long." We looked at Wiener in surprise. We thought he was used to everything. And now he says it's worth living for something that has cost him so much. Lenzen didn't stop. And we thought about the future the veteran had pictured for us. For me, a Frenchman, Prussia seemed so far away, so unnecessary. But Wiener also spoke of what I had fought for. Despite everything, I felt in solidarity with him. The fighting was getting bloodier and bloodier, and in such circumstances we had to unite. I was part of the regiment and thought without much pity about the possibility of my death. Death would end the fears of the past, present and future that overpowered me. There was a sort of fog in my mind. No, not joy, but a sense that I had finally come to realize my destiny. I wonder if this is what my comrades think. I don't know, but everyone seemed to be experiencing something similar. For several hours we travelled at a slow speed. Finally the train stopped. It was a misty grey morning. We walked to the wooden structures, the sight of which reminded us of the recently lost shelves. We were given an hour of rest, a cup of hot water with soy grains. "Think about it. Somebody volunteered for the army, hoping to be fed for free," said a soldier. "You can't find volunteers now," said another. "Now many people don't even dream of becoming an officer. They know that they won't even have time to get the epaulets of a lieutenant. A bullet will catch them before they do." However, the bullet didn't catch someone. A major, probably the camp commander, spoke before us. "Soldiers of the Greater Germany Division, your arrival at your positions overwhelms us with joy. We know how bravely you fight and we are counting on you. The same feelings are felt by your comrades in arms who are fighting now in the Polish forests near our borders. Your arrival gives us new strength. We have before us the most difficult task, the defence of German and European freedom from the Bolsheviks. They want to take it away from us, and for this purpose they are ready to use the most extreme means. Today, more than ever before, we must act as one man. With your help, we will be able to withstand the Russian horde. Consider yourselves the pioneers of the European Revolution. Be proud that it is you who have been chosen for this most difficult task. I send you the congratulations of the Führer and the High Command. Transportation and food have been provided especially for you. I know that as long as a single German soldier is alive, no Bolshevik will be able to set foot on German soil. Heil Hitler!" We looked at the elegant officer in silence. That's what it turns out. We are so needed. Heil Hitler! Feldfebel realized that we were not going to respond in the prescribed manner, and repeated the call. Heil Hitler! Rang out our throats. "Either I'm crazy," said Kellerman to himself, Pes, "or he hopes that we will raise his morale." "Shh, shh," said the prince. We were about to hear another speech. This time the captain spoke. "I have the honour," he said, "to take command of 2/3 of your regiment. Under my command you will go into battle." We understood what we were going to do, but we kept silent. The entire division will fight in the northern area. It will be divided into several areas in order to provide widespread resistance to the Russians, who have concentrated in the sector of large forces. I expect from you the highest heroism. We can't do without it. This is where we must stop the Russians. No one will be allowed to waver or neglect their duties. 3 officers can form a court-martial at any moment and mete out any punishment. Poor Fresh. How many officers have decided on your execution? We'll either be victorious or disgraced. No Bolshevik should ever set foot on German soil. And now, friends, I have good news for you. You'll get mail and some of you will be promoted. But before you rejoice, you'll get new rations and uniforms from the depot. At ease. Heil Hitler. We went our separate ways. My mind was a mess. "Everything seems to be going well," I said. "The bastard? He'll be happy to watch us get killed," hissed Gals. We lined up in front of the big hut. "That's who we got to replace Vesredau. I have a feeling we have a lot more to be surprised about, Prince. Oh, don't be. We've heard enough nonsense already. He's one of the fanatics, said Gals. Not at all. He's right, said Weena. We turned around in amazement. He's right, either here or nowhere. I can't explain why, but he's right. We stared at Weena with uncomprehending eyes. How his eyes had changed. I'll tell you later, Weena said. It won't get through to you now anyway. Paula, I am writing to you and looking at the letter I have been waiting for so long. As I read the lines you have written, I forget the Eastern Front, which still holds so many dangers. I hold your letter in my hands. It's a miracle that came down from heaven. I need a simple word. Simple words are what we lack. I read your letter, and our comrade Smellens, who is lucky enough to believe in God, prays. But nothing can help us now, Paula. Prayer is like vodka. They only numb the pain. We don't even know what happiness is anymore. We're happy when it's daytime, because darkness makes us think of death. I've been promoted to the rank of Oberefleur. Although the epaulets are still in my pocket, I already feel like an important man. All the horrible things we've been through have turned us into men. There's a roar coming from the east. Maybe it's just the wind. I look forward to your new letter. For several days in a row, we fought battles as we continued our retreat. We were led to believe that the Bolsheviks would never set foot on German soil. But in 5 or 6 places, the powerful armies of the Soviets had already crossed the German border and penetrated to a depth of about 50 kilometers. The 3 armies had crumpled the German soldiers who were defending the country. The survivors dragged behind them remnants of armaments, by which alone one could realize that they were still fighting. Unfortunately, I am unable to describe in detail the confusion that prevailed at this time. I can only tell you about the deaths of my friends, Prince, Spolowski, Zolma, and also Lenson, because in spite of everything, he was a true friend. I want to pay my last tribute to Lenson, to tell about his death, which still stands before me now. Whatever Lenson may say about me at times, I am sure that for all of us, for his homeland, he was a true soldier, ready to sacrifice his life without a second thought, so that any of his fellow soldiers could have an easier time. The way he died serves as an extra confirmation of these words. Perhaps it is because of him that I sit here now and write these lines. Lenson would never have endured the defeats that came to the troops of the Eastern Front. They were impossible to avoid, as well as cancel the order in the name of which he died. Those who have only one thought in their heads can only live for it. Beyond that, they have nothing but memories. Our attempt to save the Courland front ended in failure. The Soviet armies reached the Baltic Sea in several places. The northern front was split into 2 parts, near the Gulf of Riga and Liepaja, and west of Liepaja, in Prussia and Lithuania. The division was divided into several detachments, the purpose of which was to break the enemy by undertaking a simultaneous offensive in several points. For the most part, it ended in failure. From the offensive, we were forced to go on the defence. At this time, the division was trying to regroup in order to create a defensive front 60 kilometres to the northwest. Bad roads, fuel shortages, mud and bad communications slowed down an operation that under other conditions would have taken us almost no time at all. To top it all off, we suffered from enemy aviation. After each night raid, disorder reigned in our weakened ranks. Having received orders to retreat, the officers decided to divide us into small formations so that we would not be a convenient target for airplanes. However, if such tiny units were attacked by an enemy armoured platoon, there was little chance of survival. Under the circumstances described above, an incident occurred, after which we were almost written off as dead. We were in a village that was nothing special, just a few huts. "I've definitely been here before," Lenson said, shocked by the terrible state of his homeland. "Everything is so different. I don't recognize everything, but there are villages I know, that's for sure. My village is about 100 kilometers from here." He pointed to the southwest. "That's near Königsberg. I've been there a couple of times, and once I went to Krantz, it was raining. But we didn't care. He laughed. Neither the retreat nor the cold had any effect on Lenzen. In his native land, he was as if reborn from the ashes. But the disturbing silence in the village made him fearful. The villagers had fled the day before. There were 300 of yous. From the march, which began at dawn, we were completely exhausted, sitting and waiting for the distribution of food. Only Lenzen stood. He measured with his steps the length of the stable, against which the others leaned with their backs. Outside, the rain was dripping. Amidst the rather heavy explosions heard from the southeast came his voice. The sounds of fighting no longer affected us. They became the daily background of our lives, and we paid no attention to them unless there was an immediate danger to us. We became like those people who cannot relax and enjoy life unless a tape recorder is blaring. Apparently they are afraid of real assailants. Unfortunately, we were unable to turn off the noise, but we would have gladly done so. Except for Lenzen's passionate ranting, everything was fine. About 30 meters away, 6 soldiers were cooking. The rest were just resting, eyes closed or staring into space. Autumn blew a damp freshness into our faces. We had been through so much suffering that we no longer felt anything that would normally make us feel despondent. We were almost unconscious, and paid no attention to the groans or to the suffering of others. The wounded were screaming and dying, but this did not prevent us from falling asleep at the first opportunity. We were given food, sausages with soy puree sealed in cellophane, 1 for 2. Cold, obviously. During the retreat, those in charge of provisions had shown a miracle of dedication. They had collected so many old crumpled potatoes that it was enough to fill a motorcycle sidecar. Now they were being distributed to the soldiers. Suddenly 4 of our comrades jumped over the fence. They were running at full speed and waving their arms. "Ivan!" they shouted. We all, as one, rose from our seats. It became clear that in the next few moments we would face another battle. The expression of hunted animals froze on our faces. Those who had already had their portion of potatoes swallowed them. Lt. Vollers joined us. His field radio, which he always kept close by, was transmitting an alarm. But we did not know the strength of the enemy. In a hurry, we put out patrols to see if we should resist or get away. 6 soldiers, those who were close to Vollers, were sent outside the camp. One of them was me. 2 other companies were sent in other directions. Like everyone else, I was not so lucky. It felt as if we had been deprived of sleep for some unpleasant duty. We went behind the stables, where we had been until a few minutes ago, and found ourselves on a lawn where old logs were lying around. We should not have underestimated the danger. Out of desperation, we both hated death and sought it at the same time. The rifle weighed on my hands like a useless thing. There was no point in relying on it. There was a time when its weight, butt and bayonet gave me confidence. But today, no matter what weapons you have, it is still impossible to organize a proper defense. We walked across the lawn to several buildings, split into 3s, and proceeded as cautiously as if we were carrying dynamite. We rounded the corner of a hut. In the distance we could see trees, and beyond them, a road on which the soldiers were marching. And from afar, the new companies were approaching. "There are at least 300 of them, or even all 4, whispered the soldier next to me. "Look at that." Behind the hut were barrels of tar. Trying not to make noise, we moved behind the barrels, and immediately found ourselves face to face with 4 Russian scouts. They also hid behind the barrels. The Russians did not take their eyes off us. There seemed to be a kind of lethargy on both sides. No one fired a shot. Eyes wide open, we looked at each other. With calculated movements, both we and the Russians withdrew under cover of the house. "Well, that's enough," Vina muttered. "Let's go." It felt like we were dreaming. A quarter of an hour later, we were already digging trenches in the north of the village. According to intelligence, against us was an infantry regiment of 200 or 300 men. We were also 300, and there was no order to retreat. One after another hours of tense waiting flowed by. We were accustomed to the Russians being slow, but we knew very well what a fierce attack we were facing. Toward evening, the Russians cautiously, taking advantage of the twilight, approached the huts. Now their infantrymen were not eager to rush headlong into battle, as at Belgorod or on the Dnieper. The Soviet High Command ordered them to abandon senseless heroism. Despite the desire for revenge and to capture German cities as soon as possible, the Russians realized that resistance would be desperate. They pinned great hopes on tanks and aircraft, believing that they would more quickly finish off our small, poorly armed formations. On the German side, too, it was now rare to see soldiers going into senseless attacks to battle cries. The Bolsheviks also fought European style, using techniques adopted from us. However, we were not relieved. Our platoon opened fire on a Russian patrol approaching us. We left the anti-aircraft guns for later. There were not enough shells. It was the first clash. To those accustomed to firestorms, it seemed insignificant. If something like this had happened anywhere in Paris, an entire city district would have been depopulated, and the newspapers would have made mind-boggling headlines. Every time has its own laws. The Russians, under cover of darkness and fog, were closing in on our positions. The thought that they were about to appear in front of us made me homesick. What if this evening was the last in our lives? 2,000 kilometers travelled, blood and fear. Everything will come to a final end. Tonight might be the last night. We didn't know what to hope for. But the night passed quietly. From time to time, lights flashed. The Russians weren't in too much of a hurry. They watched us, and we watched them. I even managed to pine, although we had to guard continuously. Many others also slept. Only the frost prevented us from resting properly. The dawn came, and then heaven and earth trembled. Usually the rain muffled the sounds, but now we could clearly distinguish the movement of many tanks. The Russian infantry was calmly waiting for our destruction. We knew we were powerless against the tanks. We have no anti-tank guns, and grenadiers will not stop such a mass of tanks. My hair stood on end. We, as usual, in a hurry began to prepare for retreat. The motorcyclists were transmitting orders from the command. The guns were dragged on their arms. We could not let the Russians hear the noise of the engines. The company withdrew in a silence worthy of being depicted in a Hollywood movie about Indians. Only the cover soldiers remained, 3 platoons of 10 men each. The soldiers were given 2 anti-tank mines each. There were 2 soldiers in my platoon, Smellens and a kid specially trained to handle anti-tank mines. They were covered by me, Lindbergh, and 2 others of ours. For the first time I was appointed commander. I was given responsibility for the lives of 5 comrades. In the 2nd platoon, anti-tank mines had to put Lenzen. Each platoon had an anti-aircraft gun, a heavy, clumsy one. There were only 18 shells for all of them. With the best of luck, we could stop 18 of the 60 to 80 tanks that were approaching us. Realizing the hopelessness of our situation, we froze with fear. Lit Wollers encouraged us. When 5 or 6 tanks catch fire, he said, "It will demoralize the Russians, and in 24 hours we will return to the company." But no assurances could distract us from the simplest arithmetic calculations. Today, on this cursed day, it would seem, it would be our turn. Our platoon listened to the last orders of the commanders, and the rest of the company followed us in silence. The rumbling of the tanks did not stop. Next to the veteran I spotted Gals, and went to shake their hands one last time. Deciding to give Gals something as a souvenir to send to my family, I searched my pockets, but found nothing. I had to limit myself to a wry grin. Wollers was gone. The squads split up. I was left alone with my platoon and my buddy Lindbergh's platoon. However, it was impossible to rely on such a friend. He all turned white with fear. I myself was also too young for the task assigned to me. Threw a quick glance at my subordinates. They were looking to the south, where the sound had come from. Lenzen shouted something and pointed to a group of 4 or 5 buildings, probably a farm. We ran after him. The 3rd platoon began to look for cover on the road. The wind was getting stronger. It was snowing. The Russians began shelling the positions we had just left. Houses in a village about a kilometre away from us went up in flames. In a hurry, I sent 2 men to a position near the roots of uprooted trees. They began to dig a trench to protect themselves. We sought shelter nearby. The young explosive soldier was fearless and determined. Lindbergh and his partner rushed into a house 100 metres to the left. The Russians continued to pound the village. We were lucky to get away in time. We listened to the tanks slowly creeping toward us. It's so hard to wait for the battle to begin. The past flashed through my mind with devilish speed. I remembered my childhood and the war and Paula and all I had to do. My duty hung upon me, but there was too little time left to fulfill it. We were torn by the opposite urge, to flee or to throw ourselves into danger. No Bolshevik will be allowed to set foot on German soil. But here they are, here, and there are thousands of them, and we, called to stop them, are only 18 young men waiting for the miracle that will save them. But now the Russians are here. There were only 10 of them so far. They were coming along the road guarded by our 3rd platoon. Our soldiers did their duty, and we supported them, obeying the dictates of the heart. The first tank was stopped 20 metres from the location of the 3rd platoon. It was hit by a shell. The other cars began slow manoeuvres. I shouted, "They're coming!" The tankers decided to take our anti-tank platoon by fright. They knew what a terrible impression the mere sight of armoured monsters makes. Often only that was enough to decide the outcome of a battle. But the 2nd tank suffered the same fate as the 1st. The 3rd fell back, reached the German positions and broke the resistance of the platoon. With all their legs, the soldiers rushed away. They tried to hide in the woods, began to climb the hill, but the tank chased them literally on their heels. There was no one left alive. On the road, which an hour ago went infantry now, rumbling, were advancing 10 or 12 tanks. But they were still too far away, and it was pointless to expect that we could stop them. 5 more tanks appeared. They were coming straight at the farm, ahead of which Lenzen's platoon was entrenched. Lenzen and his 2nd number opened fire on the tanks. Those were coming at a distance of 25 metres. They managed to hit 2 tanks. Explosions rumbled in the valley. The 3rd tank passed the wreckage of the first 2 and moved straight at us. Lenzen's guys fired a 3rd shot. They didn't hit the tank, but they almost killed us. In the hut that was next to it, a fire went up. The explosion almost buried us alive. For a minute, we were deaf. 3 tanks continued to move towards the farm, continuously shelling it. The crew must have decided that that was where our defences were concentrated. Although they were out of range of our guns, we opened fire anyway. Smellens fired at the tank, which was 200 metres away, and almost hit. The shell touched the ground, bounced, but never exploded. We wanted to draw attention to ourselves. And we succeeded. 1 tank came straight at us without stopping firing. I heard my soldiers screaming. They looked in horror at the huge machine that was crushing the wreckage of the house. But the tank suddenly stopped, turned and went back onto the road. And a little farther on, the battle of David and Goliath continued. Lenzen's squad was fighting 4 tanks that were firing all their guns. We heard Lenzen's anti-aircraft gun fire its last shot. The tank closest to them spun and rammed the tank ahead of them. Amidst the smoke and fire, horrible screams were heard. Just above the trench where Lenzen and his aide had taken shelter, a tank passed, spun around, and was gone. So Lenzen died, as he had wanted, on the land of Prussia. For us, the nightmare continued. Although the tanks left, the infantry followed them. My comrade and I took cover in a trench, the other 2 behind tree roots. What had happened to Lindbergh and the 6th soldier? Obviously, I concluded, they died under the ruins of a building destroyed by the tank. And where are the remnants of Lenzen's platoon? Maybe they too lay under the ruins of the farmhouse. All sorts of thoughts were running through my head. We are likely to be spotted on the grey soil, on which any silhouette stands out sharply. We could run into the pine forest. It is on the left, 300 metres away, but that would mean to be left without any cover. The Russians would spot me before I could get 10 metres away. There was a lot of smoke, but I could hardly escape behind it. I thought only of myself and realised that I had fallen into a trap from which there was no way out. I was so sure of it that I ordered the soldier lying next to me to shoot me. He had the same thought and stared fearfully into my face. "No way," he said. "No way. You better kill me. Please." The situation was tragicomic. We looked at each other with resentment and tried to shift the responsibility onto the other. "We're going to die anyway, you bastard," I shouted. "Shoot me. That's an order." "No, no, I can't," he cried out in tears. "What, you're afraid to be alone?" "Yes. Aren't you afraid? Don't you realise there's no other way out?" From the north, already behind us, we heard the sounds of fighting. "The Russians must have overtaken our company," I said. We looked at each other in silence and motionlessness. What to say? Everything had been said long ago. Then 2 soldiers appeared, hiding behind the trees, and soon Lindbergh appeared. He was carrying a wounded man. Among the ruins of the farmhouse we noticed figures moving rapidly. Cautiously they went into the woods about 200 metres away from us. "Let's run there and us," Lindbergh begged. "The Russians are close by." "It's easy to say," I responded. "Look at that. We'll have to go through without any cover." It was hard to argue with that. Everyone looked from the woods at the edge of the village to me. If only I had had the courage at that moment to inspire the others with the idea of possible rescue. But I was unable to cope either with the circumstances or with the soldiers who expected me to make a decision. Lenzen's prophecy had come true. I was no commander, and my powerlessness was manifested right here, 100 metres away from the place where Lenzen had died. I tried to think of something, but the situation was hopeless. I knew that my comrades would make the decision for me, which was mine to make. Am I really just a coward? Am I no better than Lindbergh, who was afraid in the open, knowing how much we despised him for it? I cursed my life, which had become a series of nightmares. On that day, at the decisive moment, I had lost my nerve. I had failed to live up to my own and others' expectations. My head was wobbling, like a drunk's head when gaiety is replaced by despair. I was fully aware of what was happening, but the panic so paralysed me that I stopped thinking, and I'll never forgive myself for that. Time was running out, and it could have been used for the good of us all. Fear drove me into the abyss at the most crucial moment, in the midst of 5 soldiers on the verge of insanity. I no longer looked to see where the danger was coming from. I turned inward, but there I found only despair. We heard the rumble of a new group of tanks, the grinding of wheels, the rumble of engines. We were ready to scream with fear. Overcoming himself, Lindbergh stood up. He wanted to know what was going on. He had lost his rifle, but he didn't think about defending himself. A crazy thought was born in his head. He bent over the edge of the trench. He had grenades clutched in his hands. Again there was the rumble of large-caliber guns. And then a truck appeared from somewhere, and machine guns started talking. We stared at each other in silence, not believing our ears. We heard German speech. Someone looked into the trench. It was a German officer. Probably he thought we were all dead and went away. But in a couple of minutes we were pulled out by 2 tankers. The German troops did launch an offensive. It was led by 2 SS armoured regiments that hit the Russians in the rear and caused them heavy damage. We even took a village for a couple of days before another retreat began.